Hello again. Today our lecture is on Dante and the Divine Comedy. We have had readings from the New Testament, and then we had two views of Christianity on certain inter-religious problems with Augustine and the book of Vartan Yeriché. We also had readings from the Quran, and we had two authors like Ghazali and Ibn Tufayl, who were reflecting on the interpretations from Islamic doctrines and Islamic beliefs. Now we are going to do Middle Ages Europe, and we are going to read one of the giants of Italian culture. His name, we are in the 13th century. We are going to Italy, and his name is Dante Alighieri, better known as Dante. And the book that he writes, or the story or his famous poem, is called The Divine Comedy. Now, for many of you, comedy is something that makes you laugh, whereas tragedy is something that makes you cry. But in the ancient concept, comedy was known as something that would start well, especially for the hero, would start bad and end up very well. Whereas tragedy was something that at the beginning of the story, the person or the hero is at the top, and at the end, he's completely destroyed. So if you think a little bit about Creon in Antigone, he was the king, he was arrogant, and then at the end he was totally destroyed. That was a tragedy. But with Dante, his view of comedy is that Dante writes this book, as we shall see now. He starts in hell and ends up in paradise. So it's an upward progress, so it is in a way comedy. When he first started writing it, he called it La Commedia, and then he added La Divina, which means the Divine Comedy. Okay, Dante was born in Florence, and we have two Florentine authors this semester. We have Dante and we have Machiavelli, the other naughty guy that we shall meet a bit later in the semester. Dante, I want to remind you that the Italy that we're talking about is a different Italy than we know now. We know that Italy was only unified in the 19th century. Every part of Italy was a principality. It had its own princes, and they all continuously fought with each other. And then within every city, you also had different parties. One party supported the Pope, one party supported the emperor. So there were always conflicts in these. As a young boy, coming from a well-to-do family, he went to school and studied all the languages that people studied at that time, mostly Latin and French. And he studied mostly all the things that you would have taken in IS 201, except for the Epic of Gilgamesh and Sinuhe and Baal, which were not discovered at that time. But he took all the texts that you would have studied. One of the most important events of his life that has really affected Dante was that when he was 9, he met in the little cities, alleys of Florence, a beautiful girl called Beatrice Portinari. And he fell in love with her, 9 and 8. And she was wearing a red dress, and this love became the love of his life. And it consumed all his life. It became his obsession. And it is said that later on, at the age of, when she grew up, Beatrice married somebody else. And then at the age of 24, she died. And so when she died, she went to heaven. And then, therefore, this book was in a way for him to go to heaven and meet Beatrice. But what is this story, you know? Let us just a little bit think of how many of the people we have met in our readings have always tried to explain what happens after life. Afterlife is the only department in our lives that we never go and come back and give a press conference and say what happened in the other life. So we have to rely either on religious books or on testimonies of people who claim they had visions, or on dreams, like the dream of Enkidu, which we met in the Epic of Gilgamesh, told us that the afterlife was a very bad place. It was dark, it was clay, it was people were the crowns of the kings were put away forever, everybody looked the same. So in fact, we have in Arabic literature a very famous writer called Abu Ala al-Ma'arri, who wrote a book called Risalat al-Ghufran. And this Risalat al-Ghufran was a trip that he tried to take to the other world to explain what is on the other side. So I just want to give you here a general picture of what is this book about. Imagine if you were going to write an essay about how you today in 2020 imagine the afterlife to be. And in order to do that, you're going to use your education, your background, your knowledge, your science. You may even have WhatsApp there, you know. So all of this is going to be welded and knitted into this trip that you are taking. So, and as you go there, you're going to meet people. And who are the people that you will meet? Who are the people that you would have liked to meet in this world and never had a chance? So you're going to put them in the other world. Who are the people that you couldn't stand and you want them to be in hell? So Dante puts them there. What are the questions that you would have liked to ask if people like Socrates or people like Gandhi or others were, or Jesus Christ or the Prophet Muhammad were? What would you ask them? So in fact, this story, which is imaginary, it's not a real visit to the underworld or the other world, but it is also a mirror of everything that Dante lived and knew and believed in, whether in religion, whether in church, whether in geography, whether in physics, whether in astrology. All of it is embedded there. This is why it becomes an encyclopedia of the Middle Ages. So, Dante was born in Florence. His family belonged to the Florentine family, Florentine nobility. And Florence was at that time divided into two political groups, one group that supported the Pope and one group that supported the Emperor. They supported the Pope, but there were also people who supported another Pope. So that was always conflicts there. In 1295, he married a certain lady, one of the most influential families, Gemma Donati in Florence. She gave him 4 children. However, Dante never mentions his wife in his writings. He always talks about Beatrice. And then he became a chancellor, which was a very important position in the city of Florence. And due to a certain event that politically happened, he was exiled from Florence. And he lived in Ravenna and died in the city of Ravenna. And it is only recently when people asked to have his bones back and buried in Florence that the people of Ravenna refused and said no, because you at one time exiled him and we will not give him back. He wrote numerous books, but the most important is the Divine Comedy. Now, let me just talk about how does this book start. The book starts, according to him, it's a little bit like the Alice in Wonderland story, you know, or the Wizard of Oz. It starts on 3 days before Easter. And so symbolically, it is the Thursday, the Friday, the Saturday, and Sunday. And if you are a Christian, you believe that on Thursday you had the Last Supper, on Friday Jesus was crucified, and on Sunday he resurrected. So the story is that as Dante is moving in the woods, he falls into a pit. And this pit, according to him, is the pit that was caused when God threw out Satan from heaven, Lucifer. He fell down and he made a pit, and this became hell. So he goes down, and he is the only alive person who goes through this trip to visit hell, purgatory, which is something I'll talk about more, and heaven. So what is Dante's explanation here? He says that, you know, after Beatrice died, he started, you know, although he loved her very much, but he started acting in a very playboy manner. He left his wife and left his children, and he wasn't living a very decent life. So she appeared to him in a dream. Beatrice was now in heaven. And she said that she is going to intercede, do a wasta on his behalf, to give him a visa, to come and visit the afterlife, hell, purgatory, and heaven, to see what is there waiting for him when he really dies, so that he goes back. First, he changes his life, and then he tells the others, so that others also will repent and change their life. So, of course, this is a story that he makes. It's an allegory. But in this allegory, it's not only he who is going to go through this trip. He has a mission also of making all of us go through this trip together. So, the poem will start in hell, and it has different levels of explanation. So it is an allegory, like the story of Hay Ben Yaqdan, which was an allegory, which we could read it at the story level, and we could also interpret what it means. First of all, there is the literal meaning. The literal meaning is the story of somebody who starts a trip in hell and ends up in heaven. So that is the surface meaning. There is the mystical meaning of somebody taking a trip, like a Sufi, where his soul is going from being a sinner to becoming a pure, innocent person. So we go through that transformation. So by the time I am out of hell and cleansed, I am purified. There is also the moral meaning. Moral meaning is that not only am I doing this trip for myself, but I have also a mission for others. And the allegorical meaning is what is waiting for all of us in the afterlife. Now, this book is said to be the microcosm of the Middle Ages. Dante has one foot in the Middle Ages and one foot in the Renaissance. Why does he have one foot in the Middle Ages? Because he is a product of the Middle Ages. Interculturally speaking, he grew up in the Middle Ages. What were the Middle Ages? The Middle Ages are these extremely religious ages in Europe. Everything was religious. The architecture was mostly churches. The decoration were mostly cathedrals, churches, scenes from the Bible. The paintings were all religious. There were rules and regulations about paintings. You could only paint Jesus crucified or Jesus as a baby. You could only paint Mary wearing blue with white veil. You could only paint the beard of Moses with so many centimeters. So everything was very rigid. Education was also very rigid, and I'll talk about it a little bit. So the Florence, the city where he lived, was like all Italian cities, divided. And most of these Italian cities, they constantly fought each other. And if they didn't have an army, they brought mercenaries. We'll see this with the Epic of Gilgamesh. This was also part of the Holy Roman Empire. So although Italy was under the rule of the Pope, most of the Europe was under the rule of the emperor. So Pope and emperor constantly fought each other. So some families supported the Pope, some families supported the emperor. Some families supported this Pope, some families supported another Pope. So they were always constantly fighting each other. The religious beliefs were all Catholic beliefs. They all believed in the Bible and the church. And many of the beliefs that they had was based on the religious sacraments, the 7 sacraments of the church, which included baptism and marriage and confirmation and communion and extreme unction. These are parts of the rituals of the church. And the church believed that you have, when you die, you go to hell, or you go to a place called purgatory, where you clean yourself before you go to heaven, or you go to heaven. And we shall see now which categories are there. So these categories are correct, but of course they are put in such a way by Dante to make them more flourishing and more flowery and so forth. The astronomy which he uses in this, the physics which he uses, is based on the physics of Aristotle and Ptolemy, which are wrong. If you remember, Aristotle believed that everything is at rest until it is moved, and therefore God is the prime mover, whereas in modern times everything moves until it is at rest, you know. So Batlimos, Ptolemy, is most of the physics that we have here, including the seven heavens, and that the earth is in the middle of the world, man is the king of this earth, all the planets are around him. And this is why, of course, somebody like Galileo was put out, because Galileo said the sun is in the middle, heliocentric, and the earth is out, which meant that man is not almost anymore in the center, he's on the periphery outside. There is a lot of symbolism of numbers in this. The ancient Middle Ages believed very much in numbers. 3 is the number of Trinity, so it's sacred. 33 is also sacred. And 100 is the perfect number, which is God. So the way he writes this book is there are 33 chapters in Inferno, which is hell. There are 33 chapters in Purgatory. There are 33 chapters in Paradise, and there is one chapter called the Earthly Paradise, which is, according to Dante, the Earthly Paradise is where Adam and Eve started. And Adam and Eve, if they had not sinned, they would have gone up to paradise. But because they sinned, they were thrown out. So all our lives now is a return to the earthly paradise, so that the journey will start all over again. So this is a going back to the beginning. We are historically turning back the clock. We are morally turning back our lives to innocence. Religiously, we are turning back our lives to obedience to God. So we're starting all from that very early movement. And then, of course, we have also the virtues that he uses. During the Greek and Roman times, the classical virtues were wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice, as you remember in Plato's Republic. Then during the Christians, faith, hope, and love were added. These became, for the Christians, the 7 virtues that we talked about. Now, something interesting happened at that time, which I don't know whether you will like it or not. It was the start of the universities. In the Middle Ages, until the time of Dante, all the people who went to study or who knew how to read and write were priests. They studied in convents, they wrote biblical texts, and they were the only ones who knew how to read. Therefore, they could say anything to the people, and the people had to believe. They couldn't even read the Bible. And all of a sudden, you know, the universities started. These started mostly in Italy, and then in France and England, and they spread all over Europe. And they started teaching people who were secular. So all of a sudden, we have a new class of people who appeared, who started studying, thinking, commenting, critically contesting, and sometimes rejecting. So this educational class, each one in his own country, rather than using Latin, they started using each one his own language. So Dante is the first person who writes a poem in Italian, not in the old Latin dialect. And because the Italian he uses is the language or dialect of Florence, modern Italian today is the Florentine accent, it's the Florentine dialect. At that time also, love was a very important concept. There was different types of love. There was the love of God, there was the love of mother, there was the love of your wife or husband, there was the lusty love, and there was a courtly love. Courtly love was a love which was a ceremony that would take in the palaces where people would dance and sing and write about love, have poetry about love, write music about love, but it was all platonic. They would not touch, very much like Beatrice and Dante. Dante and Beatrice never touched each other. They were 9 and 8. So this courtly love is very much also seen in this story. And the people who were very clever about it were a group of people called troubadours, who were very popular in Europe, who would go from house to house, play music and recite poetry. And all the time, the poetry was about the woman they loved very much. Now, the woman was always hiding behind a beautiful mandilla, behind on the balcony, behind the msharrabiye. Nobody would see her. And she was always there, untouched, pure, perfect, chastity. And the man would be, like on his knees, worshipping her. These people called the troubadour are said that they have started in Andalus. They were originally Arabs who would call it utrib wadur. So they used to go from one house to another with tarab, with the music, and reciting poetry. So we'll see about this. Beatrice-Dante relationship very much looks like this relationship here. So what are these 3 parts of the afterlife? Hell, we all know about hell. It's a place of despair, stagnation, isolation, torture, fire. It's a permanent place. It's a place where if you go to hell, you never go out. Now, Dante is the only one who has this visa to do this trip. And so everybody is very amazed when they see him that he is going from one to another, because occasionally somebody says, how come you are going to purgatory? You should stay in hell. Purgatory is a very Catholic concept. Not all the religions have it. The Protestants don't believe in purgatory. The Orthodox have some concept of purgatory. Purgatory is basically an idea that if you die, you're a good believer, but you have not completed all your wajbat al-diniyya. Sometimes when somebody dies, we hear that mutammima wajbat al-diniyya. They have done. If they have not really done all there, they go to this purgatory. It's a place of purging, of cleaning. So you get cleaned, you get prepared so that when you go to heaven to meet God, you are clean. So if you go to purgatory, it's temporary, whereas hell and paradise are permanent places. And of course, heaven is a place of bliss and fulfillment, of being with God. There is beautiful music, there is beautiful happiness, and so forth. Now, in this story, we are going to read passages from hell, passages from purgatory, and passages from paradise. The passage that we are going to read from hell, I will post for you some pictures of hell and heaven also, but I have put here the mountain of purgatory. The picture of hell is like an inverted cone. It's like a mountain upside down. And the lower you are, the sins are the heaviest. And now on the top of it, there is a place called limbo, which the ancients used to believe that if you have died before knowing God, like Plato and Aristotle, who did not know God, or Christianity or Islam, this is where you go. You go there until Judgment Day, and God decides what to do with you. So limbo is between hell and between purgatory. Hell, in the chapter we are reading, it's a chapter about all the people who have killed or who have caused wars because of love. A love that is a little bit like St. Augustine, a misdirected love, a love that was not aimed at God. And if you read that passage, which is in the big book, you will notice people whom you've met before, like Semiramis. She is mentioned. You remember Semiramis, who killed Ara. We have Dido, who killed herself because of Aeneas. We have Helen, who caused a war of Troy because of eloping and running away. So all these women who have, of course, women again, you know, who are the problems and who cause these things to happen. Now, all those, therefore, who are in purgatory, as I mentioned, are people who have, in a way, they loved God, but the proportion was not correct. So we have, in the beginning of this mountain, and because it's a mountain, Dante uses very much the analogy of climbing, ropes, and going up from one level to another. And the Latin or the Italian word for sin is peccata. So we have here 7 sins that are going to be purged, to be cleaned. What are the 7 sins? These are the sins of the proud, the envious, the wrathful, the slothful, the covetous, the gluttonous, the lustful. What are these? The proud are the people who loved but loved themselves. The envious are the people who loved but loved their neighbor's property. The wrathful are the people who loved but loved so much that they got angry at everything that they loved. You know, it was a possessive love. So these are love of neighbor's harm. It's a misdirected love. Then there is the slothful. These are people who are loving God, but they are lazy. They love laziness. I know a few people like that, you know, on campus. They're slothful. So these people are lack of love in a way. So all of them are diseases in the level of love. And then you have the other ones who loved but loved too much, the wrong thing. They loved food, they loved sex, and they loved property. And these were misdirected love. So these loves in purgatory will all be put in their proper measure. Now, in this purgatory also, there is a very interesting thing that Dante does, and that is he has some physical exercise to be done in this, because every turn of the circle is called a corniche. They have to go around the corniche. So the punishment or the probation that you are going through, to make it up, you have to do the opposite of that which you were guilty of. So if you were slothful, if you were idle, your punishment is running. If you were proud and you always walked with your nose up in the air, you're going to crawl in the mud so that you learn humility. If you are guilty because you loved food too much, you're going to be on a strict diet. If you loved sex too much, you're going to be on a chastity program. So this is a way of bringing balance into your measures. And along every one of these, we meet people who are either friends of Dante or neighbors or philosophers of the time, to whom Dante asks questions. Now, we have 2 interesting people who are the guides of Dante in this trip. One is Virgil, who is the author of the Aeneid, because he's the great Roman poet. So Dante uses him as his guide in hell and in purgatory. But he cannot be his guide in heaven because he was a pre-Christian. His guide in heaven is Beatrice. She will wait for him at the door, and she will first shout at him and like a mother rebuking her son. Then she will guide him to meet God, whom of course we don't see, but he's supposed to be the ultimate God there. So it's also a mystic trip. Now, love, according to him, is the reason why there is purgatory, because as I mentioned, when he asks Virgil, why are all these people here? He says all the people here are because of love. There are two types of love, natural or rational. The natural doesn't make mistakes. The natural is instinctive. When the bee makes honey, there is no right or wrong. When the bird makes its nest, there is no right or wrong. When the baby suckles his thumb, there is no right or wrong. These are instinctive. This is natural love. Rational love is when we make choices. And we make choices, we make mistakes. So all those who are in hell loved themselves so much that they didn't love God. So they are out. They are in hell. Those who loved God but who loved other things unproportionately are in purgatory. And those who loved God so much without any exception are in paradise. So again, the Augustinian concept of love comes here. So who are the people who are in purgatory? Either faulty aim, you aimed at a wrong target, love, or too much zeal for the wrong thing, or too lack of enthusiasm for the right thing. Now, those who are in heaven, of course, are in perfect paradise. Heaven is the place where, according to Dante, all the different great angels are there. And this is the place where we go back to our beginning, to the beginning of innocence, to the beginning of humility, of erasing our sins. This is why when we finish from purgatory, there is a beautiful river in which, before you go to earthly paradise, in which Dante is supposed to swim. And one of them is called, it is called Lethe. This is the river which lethargy gives you. Once you swim into it, it erases all your memory. So you become blank. And then there's another river which only gives you the good memories, so that when you go to meet God, you don't have any bad ideas or bad memories of life, and you only keep the good ideas there. This is a general background of the purgatory of Dante's Divine Comedy. I will also go with the readings with you. We will go through the readings together. We will mostly read from Purgatory. And one of the interesting also questions that he asks when he reaches in Purgatory, as I mentioned, Virgil is taking him around. The question that he asks to one of the Marco Lombardo and one of the people whom he meets there is, are we free or are we destined? Are human beings free in their choices, or are we predetermined by God? And his friend answers him, the philosopher whom we don't know, we meet him in Dante. He says, if you were not free, why would God give you punishment and reward? It is because you make choices that you are making these trips now, and you see what are the punishments and rewards. If God decided everything ahead of time, where would be your choices and your freedom? So again, there is a lot of Augustine to compare here, the same arguments that we had with Cicero. Okay, so I will stop here, and maybe I will give you another session whereby I will follow the reading together. We will have the text. If you can have the text with you next time when we meet on Tuesday, we will go a little bit over it. We have 3 sessions for Dante, so we have enough time to go through that. Okay, have a good weekend and enjoy it.